two of our guests. Joining us is Mara Sapone. She's the Mara Sapone Shevin, Professor of Education at Syracuse University, and a member of the Syracuse Peace Council. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Also joining us is Andy Major. He's a member of the Syracuse Peace Council, and that's a grassroots organization founded in 1936, committed to nonviolence and to educate our community about issues of war and war culture. And our question as we get into this segment this morning is whether or not we should be considering nonviolent solutions as we negotiate with terrorists. Let's hear from you at 451-2414, 1-800-451-2414, or log on to our website at WCNY.org.
Thank you both very much for being here. I want to start by talking and getting your viewpoints in regard to the actions that have been taken so far from the federal government. Obviously, emotions continue to run very high since September 11th. What is your view of what has been done so far since September 11th?
Well, I think there have been some things that have been valuable and important to bring people together, to show a sense of trying to be united as a country, to support the people who were victimized directly by this war, to try and help reassure all of us, because I think all of us feel a greater degree of fear than we have in the past. Other actions, I think, have been counterproductive. Certainly the launching of the war, I think, has been a mistake, and we're beginning to hear statements now from the government saying, well, we may not catch Osama bin Laden, we may not accomplish some of the things that were set as goals. The other thing that I think has been, well, I guess, again, both positive and negative things, is that before September 11th, the Bush administration was extremely unilateralist, was rejecting all kinds of international efforts to bring safety to the world, to address environmental issues, social issues, poverty, etc. As a result of September 11th, there has been this effort to bring together a coalition of nations, and that's important. But at the same time, there's been this rhetoric that has said, either you're with us or against us. Either you accept everything we say or you're part of the enemy camp. And I really think that's a mistake in terms of how to proceed to build a world of peace.
Professor Sapone, Shevin, as what's going on, today, and you look back at September 11th, then how should we have responded as a nation to those attacks?
Well, I think, you know, what Andy said is really true. I think the most important thing is that we continue to keep thinking. And there's been a time of incredible emotion. I was teaching class when the terrorist attacks occurred, and my students, many of whom are from New York City, and have family members there. I mean, the effects were immediate. People were terrified. People were calling their mom, their dad, their brother, their sister, and there was this immediate reaction of, we have to do something, quick, we have to do something. And that, I think, is a completely understandable human response, to want to do something. And then even the response of, they hurt us, we have to hurt them, I think is very typical, but that's what I want us to interrupt. You know, the sense of, we got hurt, so we have to hurt somebody else. Because it's not really clear, and I think as the war continues, it's not really clear that what we're doing is going to make us safer.
Well, let me ask this. Do you know who it is that do you know who the enemy is?
I think that's part of the problem, is who is the enemy. You know, as yesterday they said, Rumsfeld said, we're not sure we'll get bin Laden. Well, I think we should have thought about this earlier. In other words, do we attack an entire country, and do we, with civilian casualties, which are now beginning to be reported. Yesterday in the paper for the first time was an article about children and mothers, you know, being killed and burned. And is that an effective strategy? Will that actually make us safer attacking Afghanistan? Yes, we have to do something about terrorism, but is that going to get us where we need to be?
You had made a statement a few minutes ago about the mentality of, well, they hurt us, we have to hurt them. But it seems like the prevailing feeling, at least in my opinion, among many Americans, is not so much that, but more, well, this is what they did, so there has to be some form of justice. I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that justice has to be served in one way, shape, or form. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, Andy, and how, if not a military solution, how do you find justice in a peaceful way, as I assume you would argue?
And certainly the Peace Council supports those who carried out this attack and those who supported it being brought to justice. And your question is an important one. How do we do that? It's not clear that the military assault is going to do that. So I think to insist that those of us who don't support a military solution to this have some quick and simple solution really is setting a false kind of balance for it. Clearly, going through international channels, there's been efforts for a number of years to establish an international criminal court. Dozens of nations have signed on to help create that. Unfortunately, our nation, the Bush administration, is opposing that because of fears that U.S. military people might be called to task by that same court. So to follow that kind of procedure is what we would call for. And certainly, we asked the Taliban, or demanded that the Taliban turn over bin Laden. They said, we need some evidence. We said, we're not negotiating with you. Give him to us. I would assume that if some other country, if France said, George Kirkpatrick, we want you sent to France to stand charges, that our government would say, we need to see evidence of that. We need to have some proof before we would send one of our citizens.
Let me, so that we understand the view of the Peace Council, Andy, under what circumstances would the Peace Council say that taking a military action is a solution to protect the right of the Peace Council to say that war is not the answer?
Well, the Peace Council is not a pacifist organization. So as an organization, it doesn't say that there is never any solution that war is acceptable. I think we would say, personally, I am a pacifist, so that's a difference there. That there needs to be clear goals, that there needs to be a clear commitment to trying to limit any sort of civilian casualties, and bombing by the air really doesn't do that. So it's very clear in this situation that there are other options which weren't pursued. There was this sense that we need to act very, very quickly, when in fact there wasn't, perhaps there is intelligence information that something was upcoming, but that wasn't presented to us.
So if a military response was warranted and you understood as a Peace Council that it was clearly laid out, you would support that?
Well, in the 20 or so years that I've been associated with the Peace Council, there hasn't been any U.S. action that we would have supported military action. So it's a bit of a hypothetical situation.
Well, we're in a situation now, and you don't support that.
Exactly. And, frankly, a lot of it comes back to how do we perceive the U.S. role in the world? And that gets at, President Bush has declared a war against terrorism. I want to eliminate terrorism. The Syracuse Peace Council wants to eliminate terrorism. How do we accomplish that? I don't think a war is the appropriate means to do that. I think it's taking out a chainsaw to deal with something that other tools would be more appropriate.
All right, let's get you involved in this conversation. Do you think that there can be a peaceful solution to negotiating with terrorists? Let's hear from you at 451-2414 or 1-800-451-2414, or log on to our website at WCNY.org. Our guest today, Professor Mara Sapone-Shevin. She's a professor of education at Syracuse University. Also, Andy Major, member of the Syracuse Peace Council. I guess both of them are members of the Syracuse Peace Council, and we welcome your calls this afternoon.
George, I just need to follow up on
You just need to.
I have to.
No.
We'll get to the phones in just a minute, but I just wanted to get a clarification on a point, because the way George phrased his question leaves a little opening. George used the words negotiate with terrorism. You're not, what you're saying, while you're opposed to military use, you're not suggesting that negotiations with terrorism or with terrorists is a way to end terrorism, are you, necessarily?
Well, certainly there has been our government has had no direct communications with Al-Qaeda or bin Laden himself. President Bush has said we won't negotiate with the Taliban, and he said that at the point when the Taliban were saying, we're open to the idea of turning bin Laden over to some other international body for accountability, but we need proof of that. I believe that it is important that we try to follow established international procedures rather than saying we're the biggest, strongest country in the world, we're going to throw our weight around and make demands. If you call that some might call that negotiation, others would call it following reasonable international procedures.
All right, let's get Dan and Pulaski involved. Dan, how are you today?
Just fine. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I just wanted to start by saying that I agree with your guest there, Andy, I believe his name is. And as a member of our reserve forces, he is so right. I cannot see where we gain anything by bombing well, a Stone Age country, a third world country, and playing the bully on the block, all we've done is probably create 1,000 more bin Laden followers rather than solve the problem.
That's interesting. You are a member of the Reserve Forces?
Yes, I am.
That's an interesting, a whole different perspective. Thank you.
Professor Shepard?
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that, because I think one of the things that we were quite surprised about, members of the Peace Council, was when the bombing actually did start, because between September 11th and the start of the bombing, there was so much discussion about how Afghanistan was a decimated country full of poor people that had already been hit, that they've been involved in so many wars, that there were no military targets worth hitting, and there was all that rhetoric put out. And so then it was like, well, then I don't understand where the decision to bomb came from. How is that going to help us? So I think it's important to discriminate the two choices. We don't see the two choices as do nothing and bomb Afghanistan. And some people say, well, you're just going to sit there and do nothing. It's not about doing nothing. There are a lot of active things one can do to bring about world peace, and to think about the conditions that create terrorists as well.
But isn't that like fighting terrorism, world peace?
Say that again.
I mean, the concept of can we negotiate with terrorism or fighting terrorism, isn't that the same thing as how can you have world peace? That's, to me, it's almost the same kind of, well, can you really do it?
I think you have to think, one of the questions that got asked in many forms after the September 11th attacks were, what could the United States have done to make somebody hate us like this? And some people asked that from a perspective of real surprise. We don't understand. And I think this is a wonderful teachable moment in terms of what is the role the U.S. has played in the world in terms of supporting other governments, in terms of other disagreements with other countries and how we've behaved. What was our behavior in Iraq? What was our behavior in South America? You know, what's our role been, and how do we understand that the U.S. has many facets of what the government has done that many people don't even know about? And so it's sort of a very, as an educator, what are the things we need to learn now about what is it the U.S. has done, and how, not that that makes what happened okay. What happened was not okay. Terrorism is not okay. Murder is not okay. But what is the bigger perspective around poverty and oppression in the world and the U.S.'s role, and what do we need to look at carefully?
All right, George, let's continue to see what our viewers think about the topic. Paul in Syracuse, go ahead. You're next on the program.
Yeah, I just want to let you know that the United States can't be kicked in the teeth constantly. And granted, the United States is a nation open to everybody, and you can't let yourself be oppressed constantly. Sometimes, you know what I'm saying is, let me put it this way, you can't let yourself be oppressed. You have to watch your borders, you have to watch the people that are coming into the nation, but yet you have to give everyone a chance. But the point about it is kind of losing my train of thought here, but you can't be kicked in the teeth all the time, and you have to watch yourself, and you don't know, you know what I mean? You can't let, like this anthrax thing going around, threat, whatever. But, you know.
All right, let me ask you then,
Paul.
and the two of you, are you concerned that people who are dedicated to nonviolence, like yourselves, that the rest of us perhaps aren't willing to hear your message?
Well, it was interesting. An interviewer asked us Wednesday when we were having our vigil downtown, and we have a weekly vigil now, and asked me, he said, are you aware that 89% of the U.S. population supports the bombing? And what I said to him then, I would say again, which is I'm not sure that's really an accurate number for any number of reasons. First of all, I think a lot of people are really confused. They're scared. They don't know what's going on. They think we should do something, and I'm not sure that they've had a lot of options, you know, laid out and said, of the 20 options, you know, which do you pick? It's sort of been, as Andy said, you know, Bush said, either you're with us or you're a terrorist. That doesn't leave us much perspective. And also there's been an equation that to be a good citizen, to be a good American, means to support whatever the U.S. decides to do. And I consider myself a good citizen and a good American, and I think my role as a good citizen and American is to keep asking questions and to keep an open mind and to keep a lot of information. So I really have a lot more faith in the American people. I don't believe that everybody who is flying a flag is doing it because they support military intervention. Well, I think a lot of people flying flags are doing that as a way of saying, we're hurting, we're scared, we want to do something big happened in our lives. And so, I mean, I think it's really important that we not misinterpret some of the silence and fear out there as agreement.
Are you ever called anti-American or unpatriotic when you take the positions that you do in public?
Certainly there are times when that happens now, and it's happened for many, many years. As Mara mentioned, we have a weekly vigil on Wednesdays from
Where is it?
Wednesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. On South Salina Street between Fayette and Washington, right downtown near the bus stop.
Mm-hmm.
And just this past Wednesday, during the hour we were there were a couple of people who yelled things at us who were clearly angry. At the same time, there were several people who responded very positively, thumbs up, peace signs.
So right after the attacks, we didn't hear this message at all from you. It's like a month later.
Well,
were you intentionally muted, or did you find it? Okay, we'll find out a little bit more about that, but we'll get to you first.
Aleta and Constantia, you're next. Did I pronounce your name correctly first?
My first name, Aleta.
Aleta, okay. Go ahead. Thank you for calling.
Okay, and on this Bin Laden deal and on the anthrax deal.
Right.
And can you have roadblocks from that for that, or can that's the only way I know of, is you can catch the right person doing these things.
Thank you.
Thank you for your call. But let me go back to that
Right.
question. After September 11th, one of the things we were even talking about around here is that the voice of nonviolence was either muted or not heard at all. And so why wasn't that, or did you feel that, or were you trying to say something and we didn't want to hear you?
Certainly there was a lot of that. Several days after the attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, there was a vigil that was for mourning and peace, a candlelight vigil at Thorndon Park that several hundred people were at. That got some coverage along with many other similar sorts of actions. Others of which didn't have the message of we don't want war as a response to this, that won't heal the wounds which occurred. Since then, there's been ongoing activity. There was a demonstration downtown within 4 hours after news of the military attack beginning. So there has been ongoing voices. And if you read the letters page of the Syracuse newspapers from the very beginning, that if you tried to sort that out, it would be much more evenly split than 90%. In terms of television media, so much of the coverage has focused on what the government is doing and saying, on the scares, on the war pieces of it, that they haven't really tried to bring in other perspectives and other voices.
Well, here we are, and we want to get some other voices on this program today. Let's hear from you now.
Let's go to Utica for the next couple of calls, actually. Frank, you're next on our CNY. Frank, are you with us? No, Frank. Let's stay in Utica. We'll go to Charles instead. Hello, Charles.
Hello. I hope I can make myself understood. I wasn't prepared to talk on television, but I'd like to make a point about how we find ourselves in this situation, and I don't hear really very little discussion about how we got here, the connection between our dependence on oil forcing us into Iraq, which is the source of support in the Muslim world, that the Bin Laden, where he gets his support, our presence there. So many people of the Muslim world hate us there. And that's not the reason, that's not his incentive, but I'm saying that's where he gets support. That we are in Saudi Arabia on what they perceive to be, Muslims perceive to be sacred ground, occupying that country for when you go back to the Iraq incident, in order to keep the oil flowing.
All right, Charles.
To this country, and we're still advertising on television for these SRVs.
Thank you, Charles. Did you want to follow up on that?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the question. It's very much that kind of question of what's the bigger context for this whole thing, and why are we fighting this battle, and what is it all about, and what does it have to do with our reliance on foreign oil, and what are the kinds of things that changes in our lifestyle in this country we would have to make if we were going to have a different relationship, and to keep asking those questions and not to be misled by the rhetoric. I was very disturbed when Bush said we've been attacked because people don't like the freedoms we have in the United States. I don't believe that's why we were attacked. I believe it's much deeper than that and much different from that. But people then immediately are saying, yeah, we like We've been attacked because we have freedoms here in this country, as opposed to saying we've been attacked because we bombed Iraq for many years. We've been attacked because there's poverty, or we've been attacked because there's incredible racism throughout the world, and some of our policies have played into that. So I think it's important not to reach for glib solutions and glib explanations about what the situation is about.
Got an email, Dave?
We do have an email, George. Let's take a look at it, and we'll get some conversation going on that, then we'll get back to the phones. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. That, of course, said by Mahatma Gandhi. The comment from the writer: to whom do we look for direction, the great minds of our time or politicians? To whom do we look for direction?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I want to follow up on what Mara said about what some of the things that our political leaders have told us. We pride ourselves so much on being a democracy, and I think that's important to all of us around this table and to all of us in this country. Yet what does it mean in terms of being a democracy when our president says the cause of this is that these people hate democracy, that they hate freedom, these things that really are patently absurd? And here's our leader leading us into war based on these ideas that make no sense at all and would hold up to no scrutiny. No experts about Islam or terrorism would agree with that kind of solution. So where are we really as a nation? And unfortunately, our political leaders aren't giving us much guidance.
Time for one more call, George, on the show today. Frank in Utica, are you there this time?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great.
I got disconnected for a second.
Okay.
I understand that these people hate to see killing and such. I was a Vietnam-era veteran. But one thing you people have to understand is you meet force with force. Prayer doesn't help. Money doesn't help. Kindness doesn't help, because what you're dealing with here are people who are subhumans. Because if they were, don't give me the look, please. If they weren't that way, okay, they would not have done what they did.
Thank you, Frank.
I'd like to respond to that. I think this is probably the most distressing piece of what is happening, what Andy referred to as the war culture, is the way in which we other people. We make them not us.
All right, let me just follow up quickly then. You're talking about war culture. President Bush just signed a new terrorism legislation that has people concerned about increased surveillance and greater authority for police actions. What's your view about that in this war culture?
Well, I hate anything that makes people suspicious of one another, that drives barriers between people of different races, of different religions. Some of the negative effects that people have seen all over the country in terms of racial profiling, you know, someone who is Indian being dragged out of his store and killed, racial incidents in our own city, my students who are Arab American being reported that they get death threats and that they've had signs that say trash on their doors. I think that anything that says we are different, we are fundamentally different from those people we are killing, is exactly how we got into this kind of situation in the beginning. And how come when we get killed, it's called terrorism, but when we kill other people, it's called collateral damage? I think that's part of, we're only able to do that because we say they're not like us. Those mothers who lost children don't feel the way I feel about my baby.
A lot more to talk about and a lot to consider. Our guest today, Professor Mara Sapone-Shevin. She is a professor of education at Syracuse University. Also, Andy Major. They're both members, by the way, of the Syracuse Peace Council. They're a grassroots organization. And we thank them for shedding some light on this situation.